Um, so bringing all this into, for example, I know that a lot of the class actually is very interested in physical activity and exercise. So let's have a look at an exercise example. This is from the late 90s, and we're looking at people who either claim that they have sufficient time allocated to exercise and also sufficient time and sufficient number of sessions. And you can see that if we, let's just go down here to this area. This is the area that's particularly relevant to disadvantage, and we're looking at education. And you can see here that people who um, have a higher education level, so tertiary educated people, actually report having higher amounts of time dedicated to um, exercise than people in this education area with lower education. Now, there's a little, you can go into a whole range of depth here. You could say, well, okay, this is what they say they do, but they may say they do it because they know what to say and they know the recommendations. And that's true. But studies have shown that people who know recommendations actually act more regularly. There's another factor that you might look at, and that is that people with less than 12 years education probably are more likely to be doing a job that is quite physically active compared to these tertiary educated people who do a lot more sitting in their jobs. So, you know, figures like this don't necessarily tell all the story, and we always need to be very cautious about figures and ask the questions about what about this, what about that. It's very important, and this example is a good one. Now, there are two sides to this physical activity equation, and in the literature you'll see people talking about exercise and physical activity, but they'll also talk about sedentary behavior, or sedentism, I think is the word. If people are sedentary, and sedentary is very different from physical activity, so it's another way to actually look at these issues. And so if we look at education again, you'll see here that the tertiary educated people report sedentary behavior far less, 3 times, a third less, a third of the proportion of people reporting sedentary behavior in that lower education group. So you can imagine that this has severe implications, ramifications for health outcomes. Now, this is a unit specifically talking about health promotion. So the health promotion challenge is to work out how you can motivate, entice these sorts of groups to be more physically active. This is the challenge with health promotion and public health, to access the populations that are generally unresponsive to messages. If we look then at one of the consequences of low physical activity levels, you can see that in Australia, this is in Australia, the figures are now 20 years old, but the figures persist right through to present day. You can see that the low education levels are much more likely to be overweight in both women and men, and it actually is more so in females. And you can see here that one of the consequences of being overweight is prevalence of hypertension, high blood pressure. So basically, physical activity is one factor which leads to overweight, and overweight is one factor which can lead to hypertension. Hypertension causes morbidity and mortality. It's also very expensive to treat through medication, etc. So you can see here that if we then extend this concept map to inequity or inequality, disadvantage can lead to differences in physical activity that leads to differences in prevalence of overweight and obesity that leads to different disease outcomes. So you can see that there's quite a strong chain of events that links disadvantage with health outcomes. We can look more generally at heart disease, and in this case, this was work done by Tony McMichael from ANU, and he looked at the relative mortality rate. So the early heart attacks for men aged 20 to 64 across populations. And so he was comparing different so-called classes, SES class, and he was showing that, in fact, the higher socioeconomic class had a far lower risk of heart disease over a period. Now, this is a period of 20, 25 years, and basically over that time, the risk for the higher socioeconomic group is increased. The risk for the lower socioeconomic group over that time is actually increased over that time. So this is actually quite dramatic. It's not just looking at one point in time, it's actually looking at the trends. So the more advantaged you are, the more advantage you have, and that's increasing, and vice versa for the low socioeconomic class. Very important study and clear evidence. Okay, we've looked at obesity, we've looked at, let's just write this down, obesity, we've looked at hypertension, we've looked at physical activity. Let's look at some other classifications of disease, and the story is again consistent. It's consistent across both males and females. If you look at the high SES versus the low SES, you can see the star actually means there are statistically significant results, and basically you're at a higher risk of serious chronic illness, recent illness, and reduced activity. So somehow your activity has been impaired, and people who are in fear of poor health as assessed by themselves. So they're unhealthy, and they feel unhealthy. That is when you compare, say, a low SES with a high SES, there's a clear difference. So there are a range of studies and evidence, and these are basically federal government statistics. If we look at more specifically cancer, so neoplasms, that's a fancy word for cancers, digestive diseases such as colon cancer, diverticulitis, diverticulosis, liver problems, etc. Respiratory diseases like lung infections. You can see here that let's focus on Australia here. You can see here that digestive diseases actually, as you move down the social classes, you can see a dramatic increase in both digestive diseases and respiratory diseases. The situation with cancers is actually much more uncertain, because some cancers will increase with disadvantage, but other cancers actually are more linked to affluence. And so cancer is not one disease, it's actually a mixture of a whole range of diseases. So for some diseases, it's actually quite interesting to see the impact that socioeconomic status has. And remember that diagram where we are looking at the life cycle from birth to old age, and we were saying that at every life stage there are health indicators and also exposures. And so this slide actually explores that life stage model, and it shows that let me just explain this quintile. Quintile means, quint means 5, and basically what this analysis does is it has a population, and basically it divides the population into 5 groups. And basically we've got the first quintile, which is the highest quintile, and the which is this fifth of the population. The lowest quintile is here, another fifth of the population. What they do is they compare the risk of this lowest SES group with the highest SES group, and see if there's a statistical difference. And you can see here that we've got at every life stage, we've got very interesting relationships. We've got, if we assign the value of 1 to the highest SES, we can see here that at all levels there's a higher risk. So if we look at children, for example, there's more risk in the lower socioeconomic group for them not to be breastfed. If we look at, say, adults, 25 to 64, we can see that the chances of having serious chronic illness is increased. They reduce physical activity, their assessment of their own health, they're more likely to be overweight or obese. Smoking is a particular problem. Alcohol risk is a particular problem. And again, the same for this younger age group. So again, this slide shows that there's a clear relationship between your socioeconomic status and your risk of ill health. So what we've covered today is we've looked at definitions of inequality and inequity. We've shown that if we look at various human behaviors, so things like physical activity, we've just touched on, say, an activity like smoking, which can affect, let's just stick with the physical activity model. So we've shown that inequality and equity actually relates to health outcomes, and we also explored through physical activity how this might work. So physical activity may lead to increased obesity prevalence, which may lead to increased hypertension, which then has other health implications. So there's a range, in summary, there's a range of evidence which shows that inequality can have significant impact on your health risk.